Harvard's top students gave up. Then a student on a black scholarship held up her hand. The entire classroom fell silent as a result of what followed. Not possible. Professor Williams, who was witnessing the empty room form before his eyes, declared that no undergraduate could solve this. The pupils in the esteemed advanced economic theory class packed his belongings and departed the room one by one. The assignment that was displayed on the board was quite difficult. Using social, political, and historical factors, mathematically simulate how racial inequality has affected American economic growth over the previous 50 years. 72 hours is the deadline. Reward co-publication in a global journal with a professor. My father spent $200,000 so I wouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing, muttered Bradley Worthington, heir to a banking dynasty, as he pushed his chair back dismissively. Besides, who really cares about these social issues? Amanda Chen, daughter of Chinese diplomats and a straight-A student, shook her head. It's too risky. If we don't make it, it will destroy our GPA. It's not worth it. Within minutes, only 3 people remained in the 40-seat room. Professor Williams, clearly frustrated, the teaching assistant, busy organizing papers, and Kesha Johnson, 20, daughter of a cleaning lady at Detroit City Hospital, who had arrived at Harvard on a full scholarship for low-income students. Kesha looked at the complex problem on the board, her calloused hands, the result of summers working in her hometown's textile factory, firmly gripping the worn pencil she had brought from high school. While her classmates saw only impossible numbers, she saw her own life reflected in those equations. Professor Williams. Her voice cut through the awkward silence of the nearly empty room. I'd like to try. The 55-year-old man, with 3 decades of experience teaching the children of the American elite, looked up with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed almost pity. Miss Johnson, I appreciate his enthusiasm, but this is a doctoral-level problem. Perhaps it would be better to focus on the basic subjects first. With all due respect, sir, you said that whoever could solve it would be guaranteed a publication. You didn't mention any restrictions. The silence stretched on for several long seconds. Professor Williams exchanged a meaningful glance with his assistant. One of those looks that Kesha had learned to recognize very well throughout her life. It was the same look she got when she entered expensive stores, when she applied for internships, when he dared to occupy spaces where people like her shouldn't be. Very well, he finally agreed. But there was something in his tone that sounded more like a cruel challenge than a real opportunity. 72 hours, no extensions, no excuses. As she copied down the parameters of the problem, Kesha noticed a detail that her classmates in their rush to escape had not noticed. There, hidden among the complex variables, was a subtle clue that completely changed the approach needed for the solution. What he didn't know was that this scholarship girl he underestimated had grown up, living the very realities she now needed to model mathematically, and that would give her an advantage that no privilege could buy. If you are enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and want to find out how a student turned prejudice into her greatest strength, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened over the next 3 days would forever change the way Harvard viewed the true meaning of academic excellence. In the next 24 hours, the news that the scholarship student had accepted the challenge spread across campus like wildfire. The WhatsApp groups of the wealthiest students were buzzing with cruel messages and bets on how long it would take Kesha to give up. $50, she won't even show up for class tomorrow. Bradley Worthington typed in the Harvard elite group, which brought together the children of the most influential families in the class. She's probably realized she's out of her league. To be honest, it's almost cruel to let her try, Amanda Chen continued. Her public humiliation should have been avoided by Professor Williams. They were unaware that Kesha was in the Central Library till 3 in the morning at that precise moment. Not in despair, but in accordance with the same orderly pattern that had brought her there in the first place. She worked with the accuracy of someone who always had to be 10 times better to earn half the recognition. While his peers slept in dorms that were funded by trust funds, she couldn't get the faint hint she'd seen on the board off her head. Any affluent student would ignore the very imperceptible mention of community, resilience factors among the conventional economic variables. But Kasia recognized them right away as the same survival strategies she had seen in her own Detroit neighborhood. Mum used to say that we don't break when things become hard. She whispered to herself, "We find a way," recalling the innumerable times she had seen her mother, Mrs. Shirley, transform insurmountable obstacles into chances for development. The following morning, Professor Williams came in with a smile that stopped short of his eyes. The scholarship problem had been the focus of whispered discussions and muted laughter during a dinner with university donors the night before. She called out, "Miss Johnson," in a falsely friendly tone. "I hope you've used these 24 hours to reflect on your academic limitations. There's still time to reconsider." "Thank you for your concern, Professor, but I intend to continue," Kasia said. A worried mumble that reverberated across the room contrasted with her forceful voice. A masterclass on academic microaggressions ensued. Every sarcastic comment, condescending glance, and muffled laugh from her classmates was like fuel to the fire burning inside Kasia's chest. Throughout the class, Williams directed increasingly complex questions, specifically at Kasia, always preceded by remarks like, "Perhaps this is too advanced for some educational backgrounds," or "Public school students sometimes have difficulty with abstract concepts." She remembered the father she had never met but whose medical expenses still depleted the family's funds, the innumerable no's she had heard throughout her life, and her mother working double shifts so she could afford books. Bradley smiled at her like a predator during the interval. "Why don't you just stop for the sake of both of us? You've shown that he's courageous already. If he acknowledges that he has taken on more than he can handle, no one will be critical of him." "Really?" Kasia glanced up from the notepad she was using to take notes. "What specifically do you believe he is incapable of handling? Be practical, please." His grandfather worked at McKinsey as a partner. His father runs a global company as its CEO. I listened to these conversations at dinner as a child. You, of course. You are here for your academic credentials, but that is not the same as comprehending the commercial world. The sound of Kasia's pen writing mathematics on paper was the only sound to break the ensuing hush. Something in her gaze caused Bradley to unconsciously back off when she eventually looked up. "One thing, Bradley, you're correct. His environment was different than mine while I was growing up. A world where every chance could be your last, and failure is unaffordable. Where you discover early on that the most expensive error you can make is to underestimate someone." Kasia started creating something that neither her teachers nor her classmates could have predicted that afternoon while she was by herself in the computer lab. The statistics she had learnt about racial inequality, the socioeconomic data she had gathered over years of research, and the first-hand accounts of dozens of families in her community all started to come together in a way that would turn lived reality into groundbreaking scientific knowledge, rather than merely numbers into a mathematical model. The affluent kids were blind to the fact that every act of disdain merely strengthened a resolve that had been formed in furnaces far hotter than any Harvard classroom. And in addition to intelligence, the actual genius is born out of a pressing need to demonstrate that the world is not always the same. It had been 48 hours since Kasia had accepted the challenge, and there were a lot of nasty rumors circulating about school. There were jokes about affirmative action going too far, wagers on when she would eventually realize his position, and offensive memes all across WhatsApp groups. However, none of them were aware that Kasia was in the Central Library's basement at 5 a.m, not out of need, but because she had made a groundbreaking discovery. None of his affluent colleagues could have imagined the entirely different approach to the problem that the insight regarding community resilience variables had made possible. "Are you all right, Kasia, honey?" Through the headset came the worried voice of her mother, Shirley. At 5:30 a.m., it was her daily call, prior to working to shifts at the hospital. "Mom, I'm doing fantastic. In fact, I believe I have made a remarkable discovery. Tell me." Kasia felt the enthusiasm rising in her voice as she told her mother about her idea, which explains how traditional models totally missed the patterns of economic resilience established by community support networks in marginalized neighborhoods. Mrs. Shirley knew the arithmetic of survival better than any PhD. having worked 3 jobs and raised 5 children alone. It makes me think of the recession of 2008, Miss Shirley thought. Our community organized in ways that television economists could never explain while the banks were falling. Where others perceive just chaos, you intelligent children have always been able to identify patterns. It was just that. Kasia was doing more than just figuring out a maths problem. She was putting decades' worth of collective knowledge into scholarly terms that Harvard could now comprehend. Something unexpected occurred that morning. With 2 coffees and a sincere smile, applied sociology professor James Wright arrived at the library. "I hear you're working on the Williams problem," he added, slipping a coffee towards her. It was the first professor Kasia had seen since coming to Harvard. "And before you ask, no, he didn't send me. In fact, I'm here against the explicit advice of several colleagues." Professor Wright was different. The son of Mexican immigrants, he had arrived at Harvard through the same inclusion programs that brought Kasia, but 15 years earlier when prejudice was even more explicit. "Can I take a look at what he's developing?" Over the next 2 hours, Kasia presented her approach. Instead of following traditional econometric models that treated marginalized communities as statistical anomalies, her framework recognized these communities as laboratories of economic innovation, places where necessity forced the creation of solutions that mainstream academia systematically ignored. "My God," Professor Wright murmured, examining the equations. "You're not just solving the Williams problem, you're revolutionizing the way we measure socioeconomic resilience. Do you really think it can work, Kasia?" "I don't just think it can work. I think it will change the way this university views her community forever." Meanwhile, in the elite student dormitory, Bradley was organizing what he called a farewell party for Kasia. "When she fails tomorrow, and she will fail, at least we'll have had fun watching," he posted in the Harvard elite group, sharing invitations to a celebration in the main hall. Amanda Chen, ever pragmatic, added, "Honestly, it will be a relief when this is all over. It's causing needless stress in the classroom." The cruelest message came from Victoria Ashford, heir to a publishing dynasty. "Poor thing, she's probably in the library right now, crying over her books. Someone should film it for posterity." The exact moment when reality meets the fantasy of equality. What they didn't know was that Kasia had access to all these messages, not by accident or espionage, but because Jason Kim, a Korean-American computer engineering major who was also at the university on academic merit, had discreetly added her to the groups after noticing the pattern of deliberate social exclusion. "He really thinks you don't have access to any of this," Jason had told her 3 days earlier. "It's amazing how privilege makes people dumb to certain things." Now reading every derogatory comment, every cruel joke, every handout about his impending failure, Kasia felt something that went far beyond personal motivation. It was as if every word of contempt was additional data for his mathematical model. More evidence that community resilience factors weren't just numbers in an equation, but survival strategies developed by generations of underestimated people. The night before the presentation, Professor Wright met with Kasia one last time. "Are you sure you want to do this? Not just solve the problem, but in the way you've planned?" "Professor, he spent 3 days treating me like I was a statistical anomaly. Tomorrow, I'm going to show them that the real anomaly is a system that has confused privilege with competence for so long that it has forgotten how to recognize true genius. What if it goes wrong? Then, at least I will have failed trying something worthwhile." Kasia smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Professor Wright realize he was about to witness a historic moment. "But between us, Professor, I grew up in a place where failure was not an option. The genius they are about to see was forged in necessity, not comfort." When she left the library that night, Kasia carried not only the solution to the most complex problem the Harvard class had ever faced, but a plan that would forever change the way that institution viewed the true meaning of academic excellence. What those privileged students would discover in the next 24 hours was that underestimating someone who has spent his entire life being underestimated is the most costly mistake anyone can make, especially when that person has both the intellect and the motivation to rewrite all the rules of the game. The classroom was packed on the morning of the final presentation, not only with students from the class, but with professors from other departments, some members of the administration, and even the dean of the School of Economics, who had happened to drop by to witness what everyone expected to be the spectacular failure of a scholarship student who didn't know his place. Bradley Worthington sat in the front row, his arrogant smile barely concealed as he typed on his cell phone. "Get the popcorn ready, folks. The show is about to begin," he posted in the Harvard elite group. Professor Williams entered the room with the posture of someone about to teach a life lesson. "Miss Johnson," his voice cut through the buzz, "I hope you've used the 72 hours well to find a dignified way to admit your limitations." "Thank you for your concern," Professor Kesha replied, connecting her laptop to the projector, "but I think I've come up with something interesting." What appeared on the screen in the first few minutes wiped the smile off Williams' face. It wasn't just graphs and equations. It was a presentation that began with a quote from James Baldwin on the mathematics of oppression, followed by a methodology that transformed lived experiences into rigorous scientific data. As you can see, Kesha began, her calm voice echoing through the silent room. The problem wasn't impossible. It was just poorly formulated. You were trying to measure economic resilience using tools created by people who never had to be resilient. The following slides were devastating. Kesha hadn't just solved the problem. She had created an entirely new model that exposed the methodological flaws of decades of economic research on marginalized communities. Every graph, every equation, every statistical analysis was a direct blow to the academic arrogance that filled that room. "My God," Amanda Chin murmured, her usual confidence evaporating as she realized the mathematical genius being presented. She didn't just solve it. She revolutionized the entire approach. Professor Williams felt sweat trickling down his forehead. What he was seeing wasn't just a solution. It was work that could be published in the best international journals, the kind of research that defined academic careers. And it was being presented by someone he had treated as a statistical aberration for weeks. "Interesting in theory, Miss Johnson," he interrupted, trying to regain control. "But where are his primary sources? His empirical data? Anyone can make pretty models without—" "I'm glad you asked, Professor." Kesha clicked to the next slide, and what appeared made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was a graph showing correlations between institutional bias and academic productivity. "My empirical data came from a very close source. Jason, can you help me?" Jason Kim stood up, holding his open laptop. "Sure, Kesha." "Guys, over the past 72 hours, you've provided fascinating behavioral data through his WhatsApp groups. Data on how prejudice affects decision-making, risk aversion, and the ability to recognize competence." The room went cold. Bradley desperately tried to reach for his cell phone, but Jason was already projecting screenshots of the Harvard elite group chats. $50. "She won't even show up to class tomorrow," Jason read aloud. "She's probably realized she's out of her league. It's almost cruel to let her try." Each message read aloud was like a slap in the collective face of the room. Victoria Ashford sank into her chair, his face red with embarrassment as he heard his own cruel words exposed. "The interesting thing," Kesha continued, regaining control of the presentation, "is that you have provided the perfect dataset to test his hypothesis about how privilege creates cognitive blind spots. Note the inverse correlation between demonstrated confidence and actual competence." Professor Williams was pale, realizing he had fallen into an intellectual trap from which there would be no escape. This is highly inappropriate, using students' private conversations. Private conversations? Professor Wright's voice cut through the air as he entered the room carrying a bulky briefcase. "Professor Williams, I would like you to explain why you thought it appropriate to discuss her performance at social dinners with university donors." The silence that followed was deafening. Williams knew he had been caught. His own words, repeated in exclusive social circles, had reached the wrong ears. Furthermore, Professor Wright continued. Opening the briefcase, her research was simultaneously submitted to the Journal of Economic Behavior and the American Economic Review. Both publications have expressed preliminary interest in full review. Bradley Worthington attempted to discreetly rise to leave, but Kesha's voice froze him in his tracks. Bradley, since you mentioned growing up listening to economic discussions at dinner, would you care to comment on the methodological implications of my intersectional approach? He opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, completely exposed in her incompetence in the face of real work. No, Kesha smiled gently. No problem. Sometimes it's hard to recognize excellence when it comes from where you least expect it. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, each slide a masterful demonstration of how to transform lived experience into rigorous scientific knowledge. When it ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Professor Williams, defeated and publicly humiliated, made one last desperate attempt. Well, that's certainly creative, but we still need to consider whether The dean's voice cut her off. I'd like to speak with Miss Johnson privately, and with you, too. Now, as the room emptied in awkward silence, with students avoiding eye contact and leaving with their heads down, Kesha calmly gathered her materials. There was no triumphalism in his gestures, just the quiet dignity of someone who had proven a point he had always known to be true. Victoria Ashford paused at the door, turning back hesitantly. Kesha, what I wrote it was honest. Kesha replied without malice. And honesty is the first step toward real change. Thank you for giving me the data I needed. What those privileged students discovered that day was something that would forever change the way they viewed competence, merit, and the true meaning of the word qualified. But the most profound transformation was yet to come when they realized that the humiliation they felt was nowhere near what Kesha had silently endured for months. And the true greatness is not measured by the cradle you were born into, but by how high you can rise from his. The meeting in the dean's office lasted 3 hours and forever changed the course of Harvard. Professor Williams left not only stripped of her prestigious position, but facing a formal investigation for discriminatory conduct and misuse of academic information in private social circles. Her words at exclusive dinners, repeated by guests shocked by her blatant prejudice, had become documentary. Evidence of a systematic pattern of discrimination. Effective immediately, Ms. Johnson will receive a full research scholarship. Direct mentoring for me. And her presentation will be submitted as a joint university project to the National Economics Congress. Announced the dean, his eyes shining with a kind of academic excitement he hadn't felt in years. In addition, we will implement a new inclusion protocol based on her methodological findings. 6 months later, Kesha walked down the same hallway where he had been systematically humiliated. But now, as the dean's research assistant and lead author of a paper that was revolutionizing behavioral economics, the Journal of Economic Behavior had not only accepted her research, it had devoted an entire special issue to the implications of her intersectional methodology. Professor Wright, now promoted to director of the new Department of Applied Socioeconomic Studies, found Kesha organizing materials for his lecture at the international conference. Have you seen the latest enrollment statistics? Everyone wants to come to the university where it happened, he said. Displaying a report showing a 340% increase in applications from underrepresented groups this year, it had become legendary in academic circles. The story of the scholarship student who turned systematic prejudice into rigorous scientific data was told in economics classrooms across the country as an example of how real genius trumps artificial privilege. Bradley Worthington, meanwhile, had been discreetly encouraged by her family's administration to transfer to a less rigorous European university after his family discovered that he was on the verge of failing for core subjects, the same ones that Kesha had mastered with top marks. His last Instagram post 3 months ago showed him at a third-rate private university, still trying to explain to his followers why Harvard wasn't the right choice for his entrepreneurial profile. Amanda Chen had a different but equally revealing fate. After witnessing Kesha's presentation, she sought out the young woman for a private and honest conversation. I realize now that I spent 4 years here just memorizing formulas without ever questioning what they were for in real life, she admitted. His eyes filled with a humility that his millionaire parents had never taught her. Today, She worked as a volunteer for organizations that used economic modeling to combat inequality, a transformation that she herself described as the real education Harvard never gave me. Victoria Ashford had simply disappeared from social media, a complete virtual death for someone whose identity was built entirely on posts about inherited privilege. Rumors indicated that he was undergoing therapy at an expensive Swiss clinic, trying to cope with what psychologists called reverse imposter syndrome. The traumatic discovery that all of his self-esteem was based on achievements that were never really his. The most profound change, however, took place in the very structure of the university. The Kesher Protocol, as it had been informally dubbed by students, radically transformed the way Harvard evaluated both applicants and faculty. Questions about cultural fit were replaced by metrics of transformative potential. Traditional disciplines were restructured to include perspectives that had been systematically excluded for decades. Mrs. Shirley visited the campus for the first time to attend Kesher's graduation speech. Sitting in the front row, wearing the dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, she watched her daughter receive not only her summa cum laude degree, but 3 simultaneous offers: a full PhD at Harvard, a consulting position at the World Bank, and a proposal to lead a new research institute on economic equity funded by a coalition of international universities. "My daughter," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face, "you haven't just exceeded all expectations. You've changed the definition of excellence." At the graduation party, Professor Williams made a discreet appearance, not as a guest, but as a temporary cleaning employee. His new job, after no reputable academic institution would hire him. Following the ethics investigation, a man who a year earlier had set the standards for academic adequacy now collected disposable cups under the gaze of colleagues who pretended not to recognize him. Kesher noticed him, but said nothing. There was no need. The best revenge is not to humiliate those who humiliated you. It is to build something so grand that his existence becomes irrelevant to her story. 2 years later, Dr. Johnson published his second book, Mathematizing Dignity: How to Transform Lived Experience into Scientific Knowledge, which would become required reading in economics and sociology courses around the world. Her TED Talks racked up millions of views, inspiring an entire generation of young scholars from marginalized communities. But the most significant transformation took place in Kesher herself. The shy young woman who had raised her hand in that nearly empty classroom was now sitting in his office at Stanford University, where he had accepted a professorship at age 24, becoming the youngest tenured professor in the institution's history, mentoring students who arrived with the same mix of pent-up genius and necessity-forged determination that she had once brought to Harvard. "Professor Johnson," said Marcus, a 19-year-old son of Salvador and immigrants, hesitating at the office door. "Do you have a minute? I'd like to show you an idea I had about measuring community resilience in refugee populations." Kesher smiled, recognizing in his eyes the same intellectual hunger that had once been scorned and underestimated. "Of course, Marcus, and call me Kesher, after all. The best education happens when we eliminate the hierarchies that separate us from real knowledge." Kesher's story proved that true excellence is not born of privilege, but of the urgent need to transform the world into a more just place. She discovered that the best revenge against those who try to diminish you is not to destroy them, but to build something so extraordinary that her smallness becomes invisible in the face of her greatness. And if he's ever been in situations where he's been underestimated because of her background, color, or social class, remember, every time someone doubts her potential, he is unwittingly providing the fuel she needs to prove that genius has no color, class, or surname. She only has an insatiable thirst to transform imposed limitations into infinite opportunities. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how to turn prejudice into purpose and injustice into inspiration.